Yes. Okay, so we are live on YouTube also, so we can start. Yeah, over to you, Professor Ram.
Yeah. You would like me to go first?
Yes, yes. Yes, please.
All right. Good evening and welcome to our lecture this week. This is a very special lecture today by Professor Pablo Debenedetti of Princeton University. It's also special because it is the memorial lecture for Professor Charusita Chakrabarti, who was a member of the Department of Chemistry at the IIT Delhi. Professor Debenedetti was to have given this lecture, which we have been planning for almost 2 years now. He was to have given this lecture in the month of March this year. But we all know what happened in the month of March. Quite honestly, though, we had already postponed it from March to September earlier on. Well, when March was impossible, so was September. And I'm very glad that he's been able to accommodate us today and speak to us from his morning to our evening. And deliver this lecture in memory of Charusita. The lecture was also to have been given at St. Stephen's College in the morning and in IIT Delhi in the evening or on alternate days or something like that. Some plan usually evolves along those lines. So I'm very glad that today, in addition to the faculty and students of the IIT Delhi, we will also have students and faculty from St. Stephen's College. Pablo, we are very, very glad that we can bring this talk to both these audiences. And in addition to the audience for the seminar, a number of Charu's students are attending, and I can see them on the screen. Devdas Dabal, who is now at Salt Lake City, Divya Nair, who's here in Delhi, Ruchi Sharma, and who's also in Delhi, and I'm sure there are many others who are over here. So we're very, it's a very nice event to be able to remember Charu also today. About 15 years ago, and actually I realized with a shock that it has been 15 years, Charu and I spent a year at Princeton, and she spent 6 months working with Professor Debenedetti. This was the beginning of a certain kind of a collaboration and a friendship. So on a personal note, Pablo, thank you very much for doing this. It was planned to have been in person, but this is it's certainly a very nice substitute. And thank you so much for accommodating our request to do this. So with this, let me turn it over to Saunik, who will carry on the procedure from here. Saunik.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ram. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar today, which will be the last one for the year 2020. So I think the candidates are still coming in now. So my name is Soumik Siddhanta, and I'm the webinar facilitator and an assistant professor at the Department of Chemistry, IIT Delhi. And we are very pleased to bring you this content today, which is the part of the online Pratidhwani series that the department is organizing. Under Pratidhwani, we invite eminent scientists from different areas of chemistry from all around the world. These 30-minute talks are held every Thursday afternoons. So you can find the link in our flyer emails and also on our department website. The webinar series is sponsored by Author Cafe. So Author Cafe is an online platform that aids with writing, collecting, organizing, collaborating, and publishing your research content through features and integrations with products like Mendeley, Zotero, Orchid, Crossref, and so on. So think it like Google Docs, specially designed and developed for the academic community, and much more. Today the lecture is in the memory of our beloved Professor Charusita Chakravarti, who was a faculty in the Department of Chemistry, IIT Delhi from 1994 to 2016. Born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, she was raised in Delhi, and she was a bright student, and she received the national NTSC scholarship and went on to clear the joint entrance examination of the Indian Institute of Technology. She did her BSc in chemistry from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. So having graduated from Delhi University with a gold medal, she went on to do the National Science Tripos from Cambridge University, UK. Following this, she joined the Doctorate of Philosophy program at Cambridge under the guidance of David Cleary. Her thesis was on the spectra and dynamics of AROH, an open shell system that involved a lot of nuances. Professor Charusita then became a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California at Santa Barbara under Professor Horia Matthew. It was in 1994 that Professor Chakravarti returned to India and joined IIT. So today we are thrilled to have Professor Pablo Debenedetti from Princeton University. It is important to know that Professor Charusita had worked with Professor Pablo, and we are very happy that Professor Pablo has agreed to give this lecture in memory of Professor Chakravarti. So before we start, a couple of technical details. Please do not unmute yourself during the talk. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we will try to get at least some of them through to the speaker after the talk. Now, before Professor, I hand over the screen to Professor Pablo, here are a few words about Professor Pablo. So Professor Pablo is the Dean of Research, the class of 1950 Professor in Engineering and Applied Science, and a Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Princeton University. Professor Pablo was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1953. He graduated from the University of Buenos Aires in 1978 with a degree in chemical engineering and worked as a process development engineer at the De Nora company in Milan, Italy between 1978 and 1980. He completed his master's degree in 1981 and his PhD in 1985, both in chemical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where his thesis advisor was Robert C. Reid. He joined the faculty of Princeton University in 1985. So Professor Pablo's research focuses on theoretical and computational investigations of the structure, dynamics, thermodynamics, and statistical mechanics of liquids and gases. He has published almost over 300 research publications. He served as a chair of the Department of Chemical Engineering from 1996 to 2004 and was the vice dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science from 2008 to 2013. He was appointed Princeton's Dean for Research in 2013. Professor Debenedetti has received numerous awards and honors. Only some of these are Presidential Young Investigator from the National Science Foundation in 1987, Teacher Scholar Award, Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation 1989, Distinguished Teacher Award, School of Engineering and Applied Science, Princeton University in 2008, President's Award for Distinguished Teaching, Princeton University in 2008, William H. Walker Award, American Institute of Chemical Engineers in 2008, Benjamin Garber Lemme Award, American Society for Engineering Education in 2014, Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Award, Princeton University in 2016, Guggenheim Medal, Institution of Chemical Engineers in 2017, and so on. So he has been also elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 2000, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and also the National Academy of Sciences. In 2008, he was named one of the 100 chemical engineers of the modern era by the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. So it is interesting to note that Professor Pablo also had published a paper with Professor Chakravarti on solid liquid phase transitions, which was published in the Journal of Chemical Physics. So over to you, Professor Pablo.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
When I tried to share my screen.
Okay, so yeah, just a second. I will make you the presenter again.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah. So now you can your share button might be activated now. Please check.
I'm sorry about this. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Not yet.
Yeah.
So
Let me. Can you see it now?
yes, it's coming up. It seems to come. Yes, yes, absolutely. It's perfect. So now you can just make it full screen and then you can continue.
Very good. Can you now see me and see my screen?
Yes, yes. And I can hear you too. So it's perfect.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It is a real honor and a pleasure to be invited to give this lecture in honor of Charusita Chakravarti. She was an extraordinary scientist whom, as you said, I had the pleasure to interact with, and we shared a lot of common interests, including the topic of this talk today. She also spent a sabbatical at Princeton. We co-authored a paper. But more importantly than being an extraordinary scientist, she was an extraordinary human being. And her untimely loss is incalculable for the world scientific community. So it's a real special honor for me to be able to deliver this lecture in her honor. So the topic that I'm going to talk about today, supercooled water and its thermodynamics, is one in which computer simulations have played a very important role. And so that will be the emphasis today. I will begin by sharing some experimental facts about water and some hypotheses to explain it, to explain these strange facts. And then I'll talk, most of my talk will be devoted to two sets of computational calculations, free energy calculations, and critical point calculations that seem to show that in realistic models of water, there is a possibility of having more than one critical point. I will then talk about a thermodynamic framework that is aimed at providing an overall view of the computational results that I've presented. And I will then conclude with some brief conclusions and open questions. So, of course, water affects every aspect of our lives, from commerce to agriculture to economics to the physical landscape that we inhabit. And it has, in spite of this ubiquity, it is unlike any other liquid, any other substance. It has many unusual properties. One of them is that it exists in the three-phase states of aggregation, solid, liquid, and gas, at conditions that support life and that are widespread on Earth. Now, this is a beautiful picture of Antarctica, and you can see the three phases. Here you have the liquid, here you have ice, and here we have a very interesting sublimation event where the droplets have subsequently condensed. Just to bring everyone to the same page, I want to mention some typical temperatures that characterize liquid water at ambient pressure. Of course, we all know that liquid water is stable between its freezing and its boiling points. But if you're a capable experimentalist, you can keep water as a liquid, prevent it from boiling. That is called superheated water. And you can do that up to about 180 degrees above the boiling point. On the other hand, you can cool water below the below the freezing temperature. That's supercooled water. And the world record to date without freezing is minus 44 degrees C. If you cool water very fast, you will make a glass. There is a glass transition. If you heat this glass, it will become a very viscous liquid. And when you heat this liquid, it crystallizes again to cubic ice. So these boundaries in hard lines are dictated by thermodynamics, therefore immutable. These dotted ones are dictated by kinetics, so they depend on your experimental skill. And I'll spend most of my talk talking about the properties of supercooled water. Supercooled water is not only a laboratory curiosity, there is a large inventory of supercooled water. The largest inventory is in the atmosphere. If we concentrate on the lower layer, the lower 10 to 12 kilometers of the atmosphere, that's called the troposphere. That's where weather occurs. The troposphere is heated from below because the Earth is much better than gases at absorbing solar radiation. So the temperature profile decreases as we distance ourselves from the surface of Earth, and we quickly cross the freezing point. Because of the comparative absence of efficient nucleating particles, it is very easy to supercool water. And depending on the temperature, the nucleation sites are very small nuclei, very rare nuclei, or high up in the troposphere at the height that planes fly. It's simply homogeneous nucleation, simply droplets, vapor condenses directly into water. And just to give you an idea of the inventories, I've collected here the information on the major inventories of water on Earth in the following way. If you concentrate on the left-hand column, if you imagine all the water in rivers, and then you ask, this would form a sphere, what's the radius of that sphere? So for rivers, if we collect all the water in the spheres, we have all the water in rivers, we have a sphere of 4 miles in radius. In the atmosphere, it would be at a radius of 9 miles. The oceans, it would be a radius of 420 miles. And a lot of the water in the atmosphere is supercooled. Climate scientists are very interested in this. It plays a key role in the radiative properties of clouds, so a key element in models of weather and climate involved understanding the properties of supercooled water and how it condenses and forms clouds. Now, almost half a century ago, Austin Angell in Purdue started measuring the properties of supercooled water, and they noticed that some very strange things. Here I show you the isothermal compressibility, which is the response of the density to changes in pressure. For most liquids, this quantity would be unremarkable. It will decrease as we cool the liquid. For water, it increases very sharply and continues to increase as much as we could do experiments. Austin Angell also did pioneering experiments of the heat capacity, which is another so-called response function. It measures how the entropy responds to temperature. Again, for a normal liquid, it would just decrease upon cooling. For water, you see that it shoots up dramatically, at least as you could do experiments. If you're interested in thermodynamics, these results are really remarkable because the compressibility and the heat capacity are so-called stability coefficients, and they cannot go on increasing. Something has to happen. They suggest that you're approaching a phase transition or a critical point. And here I'm summarizing properties of supercooled water and some of the properties of supercooled water, comparing them with those of simple liquids. If you take the thermal expansion coefficient, as we all know, below 4 degrees C, water expands when it is cooled, so the thermal expansion coefficient is negative. If you look at the heat capacity, I just showed you that it increases enormously or very sharply. The isothermal compressibility, which is low compared to a simple liquid at ambient temperature or a little bit above, again, increases dramatically. And here's the density with the famous density maximum. And statistical mechanics shows that for each of these quantities, there is a corresponding fluctuation. So for example, for the thermal expansion coefficient, it is a cross fluctuation of entropy and volume. So water is unusual because entropy and volume become anti-correlated at low temperatures. For the heat capacity, it's enthalpy fluctuations. And for the compressibility, it would be density fluctuations. And the first important step in trying to understand this behavior was provided in a pioneering paper that is also important for the sociology of science because it's one of the first papers in which computer simulations led the way and even suggested experiments that were performed a few years later. So this is a paper in the group of Gene Stanley in which they were looking at supercooled water. They were looking at the equation of state, pressure versus volume, and they noticed that as you decrease the temperature, the liquid became more and more compressible. So with very small changes in pressure, you could affect very large changes in volume. And if you look very carefully, there's almost a maximum and a minimum reminiscent of the van der Waals loop in the familiar van der Waals equation. So this suggests the presence of a critical point. I note, and I want you to notice that if you indeed agree that there may be a critical point, we access the region of the phase transition by lowering the temperature and raising the pressure. And that means in thermodynamic consequences that the phase that has the highest density also has the highest entropy. This is an anomaly, and I will come back to that later. They also observed when they took the gases, that is the amorphous solid formed by rapid cooling, and they tried to compress it, that instead of monotonically increasing the density, it underwent very sharp transitions. And 2 years later, Osamu Mishima in Japan actually did this experiment, which I'm going to show in the next slide. It's rotated because in Mishima's experiment, the pressure was a manipulated variable. He took a water glass, compressed it, and instead of it going smoothly, it underwent a very sharp transition, formed what is called high density amorphous ice. And when you decompress it, it underwent a hysteresis loop, which is typical of a first order phase transition when there is metastability. So all this was put together, and the famous hypothesis of the second critical point was formulated by Gene Stanley and Mishima, which says that in addition to the familiar vapor-liquid critical point, water has a second critical point, which is with a transition that I just showed you between the low density amorphous ice and the high density amorphous ice terminates. Of course, above their glass transition, it would be metastable liquids, no longer gases. And since this formulation, the whole scientific community, a large part of the scientific community interested in the liquid state, and certainly everyone interested in water, has tried to verify experimentally this hypothesis. It is a very big challenge to experiments to observe this because it's in a region where the stable phase is ice, and therefore you have to prevent crystallization and observe water in fleeting times. And this is why computer simulations have become so important, because in simulations you don't have those constraints. In fact, for molecular models of water, it's very difficult to crystallize. I'm going to summarize in the next couple of slides some selected experimental results. One could give one whole talk talking about the experimental evidence. I just want to give you some experimental evidence and then move on to the main part, which is simulations. So in 2014, the group of Anders Nilsson in Sweden pioneered this technique where femtosecond X-ray lasers were used to probe evaporatively cooled droplets, which were micron sized, therefore macroscopic. They measured the diffraction pattern, and they were able to distinguish droplets that hadn't crystallized, that don't have a Bragg pattern, from droplets that crystallized, that did show a very visible Bragg pattern. And that's how they obtained this world record of supercooling at minus 44 degrees C. A few years later, they were able to measure both the compressibility and the correlation length of supercooled water, and they obtained this remarkable maximum, which, as I will show later today, is a prediction from thermodynamics. If you do have a critical point, then at different pressures, you must observe this compressibility maximum. And then the most interesting and very recent result of barely a month ago from the same group is this experiment in which they took amorphous ice and heated it with infrared lasers. This was heated at constant density, so the pressure increased. Upon stopping to heat, the material relaxed, and we see the trajectory here. And they were able to probe it with femtosecond X-ray lasers. And if you look at the X-ray spectra, if you follow the little arrow, as time progresses, you go from a high-density signature to a low-density signature that appears before the whole sample crystallizes. So this is very remarkable because it signals, again, this duality of phases. And for the first time in real time, they could track, in this very important paper published a month ago, the appearance of the second liquid phase before the whole thing crystallized. So it's a really remarkable result. So from now on, I'll tell you about our own work in simulations in which we studied this same problem. I'm going to start talking about simulations with a comparatively old model. It's called ST2. And then I'm going to talk about two of the best state-of-the-art models. These are all classical models. In particular, the three that I'm going to talk about are rigid models. They differ in their parameterization and the value of the charges, the distance, the angles. Let me just say that ST2 is a very useful model, even though it's not the most accurate model, because it has an imposed tetrahedrality and it's a rigid model. So it exhibits all of the anomalies of water at temperatures that are higher than the real substance, the real water. So even though it's not good for quantitative prediction, it's good for studying the possibility of a phase transition at liquid-liquid transition at temperatures that are a bit higher than the deeply supercooled temperature that one needs to use with other models. And then the TIP4P models in its 2005 and ICE variants are very good models that manage to reproduce a large part of water's remarkably complex solid state diagram. So I don't want to make this too technical, but I do want to give people an idea of how it is we calculate free energies. So if you have a system at fixed temperature and volume, you can say the probability of observing a given energy is the sum over all possible configurations of the Boltzmann factor, where beta is 1 over kT. And here, this Kronecker delta simply singles out all the values, all the configurations in which the energy is equal to the desired energy. And this normalization is called the partition function. And similarly, you could say, well, what's the probability of observing the system with a given value of any order parameter? For example, it could be the number of nearest neighbor molecules. So you want to pick configurations in which each water molecule has only 4 nearest neighbors. You do exactly the same, but you pick out the values of the configurations that have the desired order parameter. Now, since this is simply the free energy of the system as a function of number of particles, volume, and temperature, the numerator can be thought of as the free energy associated with a particular value of the order parameter. But at fixed temperature and volume, this is constant. So if you take logarithms, you get the important equation that the free energy is simply minus kT logarithm of the probability of observing the system with a given value of the order parameter. So all the tricks in all simulations of free energies consist of coaxing the system so that it samples fluctuations large enough that you can gather statistics. Now, there are many technicalities in developing good algorithms. I'm not going to go through that. All I want you to know is that whenever I show a free energy diagram, it means that I found an efficient way of biasing the system in order parameter space and compute the free energy. So we did this some 6 years ago with the ST2 model. We published these results in Nature. Here you have the free energy as a function of 2 order parameters, the density, and Q6 is called the bond orientational order parameter that measures crystallinity. And what we saw is really remarkable. There is a deep minimum corresponding to the stable phase, that's ice. In this particular model, it's cubic ice, which is almost indistinguishable in free energy with respect to hexagonal ice. But at much higher free energy, which means therefore metastable with respect to the stable state, you see 2 basins and therefore 2 liquid states. How do I know they are liquids? But because they were diffusive, but also the bond orientational order parameter, which measures crystallinity, has a very low value. And if I project the phase diagram onto the order parameter coordinates, you see that I have a high density liquid basin, a low density liquid basin, and a crystal basin. Going from the low density liquid to the crystal entails practically no change in density. The system simply is totally hydrogen bonded and it develops long range order along this coordinate. So in this result in Nature, we were able to show that for the ST2 model, you do indeed have metastability between 2 liquid phases where the stable region is the crystal. Here I show you also from that Nature paper, we use 6 computational techniques. All of them showed this liquid-liquid transition. The red numbers give you simply the multiples of the relaxation times during which we sampled the system. So we sampled the system for a very long time to achieve equilibrium on the order of 100 to 10,000 relaxation times. We also showed that the free energy barrier between the 2 liquid states scales as the size of the system to the 2/3. That's demanded by thermodynamics because the free energy barrier is proportional to the formation of an interface, hence proportional to the surface area. Also, this bond orientational order parameter is supposed in the low density, in the low ordered region where the liquids are stable, it's supposed to decay as n to the minus 1/2, and indeed we see that. It's very easy to see the system phase separate. Here I've just colored the molecules according to the local density into local high density and low density liquid, and very soon you see the formation of an interface. So to summarize this first result, using free energy techniques for the ST2 model, we show that clearly it is possible for a water-like model to show a metastable phase transition. Early this year, we published in Science a second paper in which what we used was much more accurate TIP4P models. And what we did now is investigate specifically the presence of critical points. And we did this using a technique called histogram reweighting. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically you need to run very long simulations. For those of you who do simulations, notice we sample on the order of tens of microseconds. And as you approach the critical point, you can see clearly that the system is fluctuating between a high density phase and a low density phase for both models. Here we collect the statistics of these fluctuations at the critical point in the form of heat maps of probability density, and you can clearly see a bimodal distribution. The technique of histogram reweighting allows you to gather statistics of a fluctuating quantity and then predict the histograms or the distribution of that quantity at other thermodynamic conditions, and then extract the whole thermodynamic consequences that follow. And here I show you what happens with the distribution of densities as you increase the pressure at fixed temperature. These are pressures in bars. At 1.5 kilobar, you have a low density predominance. As you increase the pressure, you go through a bimodal region, and then eventually at high enough pressures, you have a high density predominance. The symbols are results of the simulations. The lines are the histograms reweighted to these conditions from simulations performed at other conditions. So you can see that the technique indeed performs extremely well. And what I'm going to show you next is that these statistics of fluctuations conform to critical fluctuations associated with the Ising universality class. So it's one of the triumphs of the theory of the statistical mechanics in the 20th century. The modern theory of critical phenomena shows that liquids have the same so-called universality class, that is, they behave in terms of the long-range fluctuations close to critical points in the same way as the spin Ising model. But because liquids lack the simple symmetry of spin up, spin down, the order parameter is not actually only the density, but as shown by Wilding and Bruce, it's a linear combination of the density and the energy. And so numerically, to show whether there is a true critical point, we're going to try to reproduce this very nice expression that parameterizes the fluctuations in the magnetization of an Ising model, where M is the magnetization at the critical point. And what we use as the parameter is this linear combination of density and energy, normalized such that its mean is 0 and it has unit variance. And when we do that, we compare the green line, which is the universal Ising model, with the numerical fit of TIP4P 2005, TIP4P ICE. And we were able, these are simulation results, and the way you do this is you ask, well, what's the critical parameter that I need to use in order to get this best fit? And from that, you obtain the values for the critical temperature and the critical pressure. So this was indeed very satisfying. We showed that within numerical accuracy, the criticality behavior of these two models is 3D Ising. And the next calculation that we did is to calculate the structure factor, which is the Fourier transform of the pair correlation function. So we're performing the computational equivalent of a scattering experiment, where K is a wave vector. The structure factor in the low wave number limit is related to the isothermal compressibility, which, remember, grows anomalously near a critical point and diverges at the critical point. And then we analyze the structure factor using the Ornstein-Zernike equation, where the subscript N denotes normal and A denotes anomalous, having to do with the presence or proximity to the critical point. Psi is the correlation length, which gives you the distance over which density fluctuations become uncorrelated. And to do this simulation, you have to use very large systems. So these are extremely computationally demanding, 36,000 molecules, because you need the computational box to contain enough correlation lengths. And you can see, this is for the TIP4P 2005 model, that as you lower the temperature towards the critical point, there is a pronounced increase in the structure factor, which, as I showed you before, when you extrapolate it to zero wave vector, you get the compressibility. And also by fitting the data to the Ornstein-Zernicke equation, you get the correlation length. And so here I show you the compressibility in red, the correlation length in black. The lines are not fits, we just drew them through the data, but they have the pre-imposed slope with the Ising universality class exponents. So the 3D Ising model has an exponent, a critical exponent of 0.63, which tells you how the correlation then diverges, and has a critical exponent 1.26, which tells you how the compressibility diverges. And when you do that, you can regress then the critical temperature, and we get a value which is in very good agreement with the one independently obtained here. Let me show you, remind you, from the Ising model calculations. Here we get 172, and then for the scattering calculations, we get 173. So this, again, is very satisfying because it shows that these two models have a critical point that satisfies, a second critical point, a liquid-liquid critical point, that satisfies Ising universality class. So in the last few slides, I want to take us now away from although not totally away from simulations, but I want to bring a thermodynamic framework to analyze this. The basic idea here is that because water is phase separating into high density and low density liquid, before you reach that phase transition, you can look at any water molecule, look at its local environment, and classify it as being low density if it's tetrahedrally coordinated, or high density if it's anything else. And then you postulate that the free energy obeys a mixture model where B, superscript B denotes the low density state, A denotes the high density state. So you have a free energy of mixing. X is the fraction of water molecules that have the low density environment. And this is the non-ideal interacting term, where this is a characteristic interaction energy. However, I don't want you to think of this as a mixture model, because the environment is totally fluctuating. This fraction of low density state is fluctuating all the time and is determined by a minimization of the free energy. So at each temperature and pressure, there's an equilibrium value of the low density state. And you postulate that the free energy difference between the low density and high density is an expansion in temperature and pressure with coefficients that you will seek to fit. And finally, because this expression is mathematically symmetric in terms of x, when 1 minus x, you can very easily show that if you take two derivatives of the free energy, you have a critical point when W is equal to 2. And then to make this more general, we allow a temperature and a pressure dependence in W. So what is it that we do? We run simulations. We choose an order parameter to determine when a molecule is in the low density or in the high density state. And then we fit the parameters, for example, the fraction of low density state. We fit them from simulation, and we obtain all the adjustable constants. And this is the sort of excellent fit that you get. So here you see simulation data for ST2 and the fits that we obtain by assuming the two-state models. It's a very, very good fit. And this has become a very popular approach because it's very demanding to find critical points. I just showed you recently for TIP4P, we need to do simulations of order approaching 100 microseconds. So it's much more economical to do simulations here and then to fit the results to the two-state model. And we did the same thing here with TIP4P. Of course, this is less rigorous than what we did before. We do this to get a preliminary estimate of the critical point, and then we do the very rigorous calculations that I just showed you. And so to end, I want to end with an intriguing result. This is a different model. It's tip 5P. It has a liquid-liquid critical point. And these anomalies of water always come in a pattern, and thermodynamics imposes very strict constraints. So thermodynamics tells you that whenever there is a minimum in the line of compressibility extrema, it means that the line of density extrema has a maximum in temperature. And whenever there is a minimum in pressure in the line of density anomalies, that means an intersection with the line of heat capacity extrema. So this is a striking pattern that many models had, and we very recently asked ourselves if there is some universality to this pattern. So here I'm showing you in actual pressure and temperature, these curves. This is the locus of density extrema, compressibility, and heat capacity for several water models, as well as for real water fitted to one of these two-state models. And what we did is we simply introduced the scaling variables. We scaled the temperature by the critical temperature and the so-called nose of the maximum density curve. And we scaled the pressure by the pressure corresponding to this temperature and to the minimum pressure along the line of density maximum. When we do that, you see a remarkable collapse, not perfect, but remarkable over a wide range of temperatures and pressures, suggesting that criticality and all of these anomalies obey some quote-unquote universal patterns, although we need to, and this is a recent result which we need to analyze to see its true generality. So let me conclude by saying the following. We've shown that there is a liquid-liquid transition ST2 and the two tip 4P models. We've done so by free energy and criticality calculations. I introduced a two-state thermodynamic framework to bring these calculations to an overall global understanding. But there remain many open questions. I've said nothing about real water. These models are good, but not perfect. So whether real water has a true critical point needs to be determined by experiments. The recent experiments that I showed you are certainly consistent with that idea. So I think we're approaching a point where there is consensus that this phenomenon is real. We don't have a good understanding, systematic understanding of the effect of force fields on the liquid-liquid transition. This is a very active area of research, how small changes in the geometry of the molecule affect the move of the phase transition. There are many groups, including ours, that is studying this. I said very little about the very interesting dynamics. You have, as you approach the critical point, you're also not far from a glass transition. So you have critical slowing down compounded by glassy dynamics. It's very interesting. We have some work there, other groups too. I don't have time today to talk about that. I've mentioned this intriguing idea of scaling and universality, and we will see how general this is. So the last thing I want to do is to thank the many people who contributed to this, in particular the Free Energy Studies, Jeremy Palmer, Rakesh Singh, Amir Haji Akbari, and my senior colleagues at Princeton. The study of metastable criticality, Gul Cersei, a postdoc at Princeton, and Francesco Shortino, with whom I had the pleasure of collaborating, and the thermodynamic framework, my colleague Mikhail Anisimov at the University of Maryland, and Betul Ural Khan at Bogazici University. So I also want to thank the National Science Foundation for its financial support and the calculations which were done in the Princeton high computing environment. So I'm going to go back to my normal screen, and I will be very happy. I thank you for your attention, and I will be very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor Debenedetti, for the insightful and stimulating talk. Of course, like our viewers seems to have a few questions, and so we will take them now one by one. So the first question is from Professor Divya Nair. So the question is, in TIP4P ICE model, the HDL phase seems to have slightly less free energy than the LDL phase. Is there a specific reason for that?
For the TIP4P, I did not present free energy results. I presented criticality calculations. We have not done free energy studies for the tip-4p ice. On the other hand, we have computed using the two-state model the coexistence curve. And then at the coexistence curve, the free energy needs to be identical in the two phases, and it is. So the relative free energy of the two phases varies depending on the thermodynamic condition, but at coexistence, by definition, it needs to be.
Okay. Okay, so I think another question is from her is liquid phase transition is also seen in biomolecules like proteins that separate into gel-like phase inside the living cells. Do you think water may be showing such HDL, LDL phase behavior in such environment as well, although temperature is not as low as 220 Kelvin?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I don't have a definite answer. We and others are studying phase separations of proteins and cells. From the very preliminary calculations that I have seen, which are with simplified treatments of water, the water exhibits interesting changes in its hydration behavior, but it doesn't phase separate at those comparatively higher temperatures into distinct HDL and LDL phase. But the solvation environment is quite different when you have the two different liquid phases.
Okay. So there is a question from Dr. Nilanjana Sengupta. So is there any commonality in the transition states between the LDL and HDL obtained from various models? That's the question.
That's a very good question. We haven't started, the two techniques that I have in my group we've been using were free energy studies, where we concentrate on studying free energies of the two metastable phases, and the criticality phases, the criticality calculations, where we don't really go below the critical point, we're above the critical point. So we have not studied the transition states systematically. From the preliminary calculations that we see, there is one plot in the Nature paper where we use the local structure index, and there you could see a continuous evolution of the local structure index and going from the low density phase to the high density phase. So in that sense, the transition state has an intermediate value of the local structure index, but these are not states that we have characterized systematically.
Okay. Okay. So the next question is from Dr. Dhabal. So what causes some water models to show the LLCP and not others? In other way, what inherent properties makes ST2 TIP4P2005 model to show LLCP and not the other models?
Well, as I mentioned in one of my last slides, this is an area of current research. I don't have a general answer. I can tell you one very insightful result. Francesco Shortino published a physical review letter paper on ST2, in which he made ST2 flexible. So I mentioned at the beginning that ST2 is a rigid model. Francesco Shortino introduced the possibility of the HOH angle to fluctuate. What you observed is that had a profound effect on the stability of the liquid-liquid transition. In particular, for a flexible enough model, he was able to bring the liquid-liquid transition to the stable region. So rather than being metastable with respect to the crystal, it became stable and could therefore be observed without any problems of rapid crystallization. By observed, I mean in calculations. So we at least know that in one model, flexibility has a considerable effect in the possibility or in the stability of the liquid-liquid transition. I don't have a general answer. As many of you who are interested in this area may know, there is a very popular model called MW, developed by Valerio Molinero, which is a very good parameterization of the Stillinger-Weber model that includes three-body interactions to force local tetrahedrality. That model is an atomic model. It's not a molecular model. And that model doesn't have a liquid-liquid critical point. So the short answer to the question is that we don't know. I don't have a complete answer. It is a very active area of research, and I hope in a year or two to have a more systematic answer on what in particular causes one model to have a liquid-liquid critical point and another not to. Now, from a thermodynamic point of view, what is happening is clear. You do have these enhanced fluctuations that I showed at the very beginning of my talk, be they density fluctuations or enthalpy fluctuations. So the question is whether these fluctuations are large enough to support a phase transition. So from a thermodynamic point of view, what is happening is very clear. From a geometric point of view, namely, how much do you need to enhance the tetrahedrality for you to show this phase transition is an open question. What we do have in all of these models is the ability of them to form local states that are both low energy, low entropy, and low density. When you have these correlations, you have the possibility of a liquid-liquid transition.
Okay. So probably we'll take a last question today. So it's from Ruchi Sharma Pandey. The water-like anomalous behavior is also observed in other network-forming liquids like liquid silica and beryllium fluoride. Have you also investigated the density variations in such liquids?
No, in my group we had focused. We have focused almost exclusively on water. We have done some work in generalized Stillinger-Weber models, of which the MW model is just one particular manifestation. There are other groups in the US that are doing that. We do not want to duplicate that work, but that's a very important. I'm glad that that question was asked, because the commonality that all these models have is the tetrahedral coordination and the ability to form networks, space-spanning networks. But no, I have not. The short answer is I have not looked at the density changes in silicon or silica or beryllium fluoride.
Okay. So although there are some other questions, but I think because of the interest of time, we have to end the session now. So I would like to thank you again, Professor Pablo, for joining us today, and also we hope to host you in our institution physically, sometime when this COVID crisis gets over, hopefully soon.
Thank you.
And and before we leave, I would like to thank Professor Janakiram Vaitla and Professor Biswarup Chakravarti who are co-organizing this webinar series. We are also grateful to Professor Anil Elias, our head of the department, and Professor Ram for their constant guidance and support and their help in organizing this webinar successfully. And our next talk of the series will be delivered by Professor Subrata Sinha from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, on January 7th, 2021 at 4 p.m. So we hope to see you all soon. Have a very nice evening. And thank you again, Professor Pablo.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Pablo. It's been just wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really honored.
Thank you.